Today I'm joined by Nikki Tugano, the founder of SeenCulture, who last year hit the news in Australia when she raised money for her startup against practically all of the odds. Nikki is a solo, non-technical founder building a tech company. She's also a woman and a person of colour. And while some in the industry have said that pointing to those characteristics implies that Nikki is playing the role of a victim, that couldn't be any further from the truth. The reason people talk so much about gender and skin colour in the startup industry is simple. It's a horribly discriminatory place. And contrary to the privileged views of a few, the discrimination doesn't stop at the decision to invest or not, and it most certainly doesn't start there. Today's interview is more than just a story about Nikki's journey. It's about her response to it. It's about the power of channeling difficult lived experiences into an opportunity to help people feel seen and to be given opportunities that the circumstances of their birth make it harder for them to access through no fault of their own. It's a story about perseverance, about the sheer refusal to give up. It's about stubbornness and triumph and not being angry when it's so easy to be. But mostly it's about a person's propensity to go without and go beyond for a mission that can only matter enough to do so if they've lived the challenges that will continue to plague others if they stop. This is a story about what happens when you back the founders who do not give up, the ones who feel as though that is never an option, and how investors looking for traits to elevate the chances of success need to look at those who've overcome more to get in the room. Because if we're talking about merit, as those with privilege often do, the founders who've worked harder to get where they are will always work harder to get where they're going. Before the show, I asked Kate Kurgazova to tell me about Nikki, who she's known for years. Kate said, Nikki's not afraid to chase her dreams. She has lots of ambition. She's not afraid to act and take a chance. She's selfless, whether she knows people well or not. Nikki has also convinced me over the years that some disadvantages can be a huge advantage. She found a new employee for the company I was working at, and I remember thinking, why is she bringing on this person? We were in a really male-dominated industry, and she brought in this girl who was really quiet. She didn't have a lot of experience in Australia, and I wasn't convinced. But Nikki was really enthusiastic. 3 years later, that person is one of the best team members we have. Today's story about an articulate and determined leader begins in the Philippines, with a quiet girl who didn't speak her first words until the age of 5. A world away from the force of nature she's since become, Nikki was raised by her grandmother, and that's exactly where I want to start. What kind of person was your grandma, and what were some of the most memorable things that she taught you about?
She was very selfless, very giving in that she really stayed true to her role of looking after others, but certainly in the way that my grandparents and my parents grew up very poor. When you're in those sorts of circumstances, there's not a lot that you can give, but what you can give is your time and attention. And that's something that she did like over and above, And so I guess my relationship with her is a little bit mixed in that I have a very fond love for her, but at the same time, certainly because I myself am very stimulated from an emotional and intellectual perspective. That's not something that I was able to engage with in my relationship with her. But yeah, I give a lot of credit to that style of parenting that, has been a huge part of who I am today.
Often in our childhood experiences, we have one parent who is more in tune to our emotional needs than another, if one isn't or if both aren't. Do you think that maybe not having two traditional parent figures in your life taught you to be more inherently independent than your peers?
Absolutely. And a lot of the way that I see it is through the lens of attachment styles. I know that you probably might be a bit familiar with it, but for anyone that might be listening, there's, different attachment styles that we have, which are very much governed by how we, attached to our primary caregivers, in the first few years of our life. And because I didn't have a strong, emotional attachment with my caregivers, be it my parents or my grandmother, that's meant, and there's actually another level on from attachment styles related to maladaptive kind of schemas. And so this is very vulnerable. I don't think I've ever shared this in media, but there's an assessment you can do to find out what your attachment style is. And, you're either secure or insecure. And then within the insecure varieties, there's being an anxious attachment, being avoidant, and then fearful avoidant or disorganized is a combination of the both. Now, you can go a layer deeper and do these maladaptive schemas as well that enable you to really dig deep in terms of what's the core thing for you. And for me, I can't remember how many there are. There's at least 12, maybe 18 of them. And the key one for me was emotional deprivation, the one that I was certainly lacking in the early years. And I can't say enough how much that's really shaped the way that I have been able to and not been able to engage in relationships with others.
Your willingness to engage in testing like that, I think, speaks to your self-awareness. And I want to go more into that. But before we do, one of the other parts of your childhood is that you were an only child. And I'm also an only child, and I had a wonderful experience with that. There's an informal view within society that people who are raised as only children can grow up to be arrogant and self-centered. I think that's predicated on the assumption that those children aren't taught lessons about sharing or thinking about others before themselves. What doesn't get spoken about are the potential positives that can come from growing up without siblings. You were an only child, and you're also from a broken home, traditionally speaking. If you had to reflect on the positive things that you learned from being an only child without the support network or peer relationship that others might have, what would they be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's also in connection to your earlier one around, needing to be more independent. I think that's certainly driven quite a lot of that. Obviously, as an only child, you don't have these siblings to have as a support or to play with or to engage with. And I don't think a lot of people realize what that means for how much you don't learn when you don't have a sibling.
Well, I mean, everyone's met a dog that hasn't been socialized, and they're not usually very fun to be around. It's the same kind of thing.
Exactly right. Yeah. And there are some people that take it one way and others that don't. But certainly in my case, particularly as well, because I didn't have the most nurturing kind of parents, what that meant was I was in some ways forced to grow up quite quick. And when I say grow up, I mean depend on myself more. And I guess you could call that independence. Because I was out of control of how other people operated around me, what that meant was the more that I took accountability for what happened to me, the greater then I was able to feel like I could control my own experience of life and that sort of thing. And so I feel like what that meant is that I developed a really strong sense of an internal locus of control, which has also been a huge factor in my intrinsic motivation to pursue the life in the way that I have.
It reminds me of something my mother used to tell me, and I guess was one of the most significant lessons of my childhood that she tried to get across was, you can't control what happens, but you can control how you respond to it. And I think that's something that, sometimes the world can be pretty unfair and life can be pretty unfair, but every time something happens, you get the choice of how to respond to it. Later in life, as an adult, to study both psychology and commerce. And anyone not living under a rock will have heard the common line that's thrown around by people in business, often in defense of poor behavior, mind you. And that quote is, "It's just business, it's not personal." As someone who's studied both people and business, do you think business is ever not personal?
Business is driven by people. And so I see them as very much like one and the same. It's just kind of like business is understanding people, but in a systemic kind of way. Because instead of dealing with an individual, you're dealing with many individuals in a certain business or system with a number of different factors and incentive structures and that sort of thing. Is business ever not personal? I mean, there is a way that you could perceive it that way. However, obviously looking at it through my lens of someone that is psychologically inclined and very interested in human behavior, we act irrationally, and that irrationality comes from acting based on our emotional states, and our emotional states are governed by what we personally feel and experience. And so if you really break it down, business can be very personal, is in my case, certainly very personal. And when a decision is made that is for the benefit of the business rather than an individual, and that's usually where that kind of quote emerges, it's to separate, this is not as a result of you as a person, it's a result of how we're serving the greater business. But it's always in the delivery of how those sorts of conversations or decisions are portrayed that make it seem like it's not really taking into consideration the fact that that is being delivered to a human being who has feelings and emotions that they then react to.
It often seems like a defensive element of a decision that has a human cost a lot of the time. You said that business is essentially understanding large groups of people, like how do people behave en masse. I think a lot of people grew up in a setting where we was taught that if you wanted to be commercially inclined, you would go and do a commerce degree, and that would teach you all you need to know about running a business. As it relates to your work now as an entrepreneur and a founder, would you posit that understanding psychology is more valuable to running a business than a commerce degree?
Yeah, 100%. Because understanding human beings, or psychology rather, is the source of how business is conducted. It's kind of like the starting point. So I would absolutely advocate for psychology being a much more integral skill or domain to understand.
Coming back to self-awareness, I've spoken to a number of guests about the presence of self-awareness within a person and how it's the most important attribute that I look for when choosing to work with someone. According to a study referred to in the Harvard Business Review, 95% of people believe that they are self-aware when you ask them, but only 10 to 15% of people possess any evidence of that trait. So we've got 95% of people running around believing they're self-aware, believing they're something they're not, making decisions heavily influenced by their biases, whilst only 10 to 15% have the capability to navigate those biases. Do you think we need to talk more about the implications of that when it comes to startups trying to raise money from investors who might not be as in tune to themselves as they think?
100%, yeah. And I really credit the fact that you have this as a central focus for like people you want to work with, people who are self-aware. It's so interesting how many people out there are completely ignorant to the fact that they're really not. And it's a big part of why I think it's important to understand how you're seen, right? Because it's one thing to have your own self-perception of, for instance, your own strengths and areas of development, but it's another thing to know and understand how other people perceive those things. And usually we only know one side. We don't know the other side. I think it's incredibly important to understand, well, in order to be self-aware, you need to understand how others perceive you, because we're often blind to our own stuff. And this is really strongly linked to what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we tend to overestimate our own capabilities relative to how other people perceive them. And it kind of relates to the fact that we can mistake confidence for competence.
For people who aren't aware of it, is Dunning-Kruger at the other end of the scale to, say, imposter syndrome?
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. There are obviously many factors involved, but yeah, Dunning-Kruger effect is when we tend to be very overly confident, whereas imposter syndrome is obviously when we feel like we're an imposter and we're not super confident in our abilities, and yet there's other evidence to demonstrate that actually, we are. It's one of the key features in our product to demonstrate what is that perception gap, so that we're bringing awareness to people's blind spots and can really elevate their self-awareness.
So a lot of people talk about self-awareness being a force multiplier for outcomes. And if you look through history, some of the world's best leaders have possessed self-awareness. It's interesting because 18% of women demonstrate self-awareness compared to just 9% of men, which makes them 100% more likely than men to be self-aware. It also means, by the data alone, that they are likely to be better leaders. When I asked Cindy Gallup recently about funding inequality in the startup industry, she said, data does it all. If self-awareness is indeed a superpower that twice as many women than men possess, why is it really that we don't see more funding of women-led startups? What did your experience raising money teach you about that?
Oh, that's a big question. I think there's a lot of different factors. Certainly bias plays a huge role, huge role. And this idea of like a self-awareness, it's kind of related to that whole Dunning-Kruger effect in that we can mistake confidence for competence. Men typically possess characteristics that are more aligned with an extroverted, confident persona than women do. And as a result, it puts more confidence in prospective investors in their ability to be able to achieve certain outcomes. That said, confidence doesn't equal competence. And so, they make all of these incorrect decisions because they're basing it on, a very charismatic individual who was able to put together a really great pitch and be really convincing. Now that's only one side of it, but the other is also, and forgive me, I do look at all of this from a psychological perspective, but another bias beyond Dunning-Kruger effect is, for instance, the affinity bias. And more often than not, an investor making a decision on whether to make an investment in a founder, that more often than not are, a man, and of a certain background and of a certain socioeconomic status. And typically what that means is that it's easier for them to be able to relate to and empathize with others who represent a similar kind of profile, i.e. other men from similar backgrounds. And so when they're able to better understand the pain point that's being pitched and then the solution to that, they can empathize with it so much more easier. Whereas if you're like, let's just say in the case of me, there was a point in time, and I don't, for a number of different reasons, I don't necessarily position my business this way, but obviously I'm a huge advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, it is very difficult for someone of a different background to me from a demographic perspective to be able to relate to the pain point of being someone that's, underrepresented, neurodiverse, and introverted, 3 categories of which I belong to. And so what that means is that they're not experiencing the same level of pain in order to have as much conviction to want to invest in solving that problem. And so this affinity bias really, really plays a role because we have this preference and favoritism for people who are like us because we get them a little bit better. We can relate to.
They're in our group, and that's I guess another way of looking at it is that in group bias. Are they a part of my group, and do I want them to succeed because they share my story, as opposed to maybe taking a step outside of that comfort zone and saying, I would like to hear your story and hear how you experience life, and also what problems that you see that you might be able to solve that I just simply don't see. In preparation for this interview, Kirsten Hunter, the managing director of Techstars in Australia, who wrote the first check for your company, told me that you're building a product to identify the people who put the work in but don't get seen, potentially even by people who lack the self-awareness required to see them. Can you tell me exactly what SeenCulture is and what problem you're trying to solve?
At SeenCulture, it's our mission to shine a light on untapped potential, and that's in service of our greater vision to create a world where everyone feels seen, no matter their background. Now, I personally have had a lot of work experience in the HR industry. And so a lot of the focus, at least for today, within a workplace or organizational setting, how can we enable employees who are typically overlooked and undervalued to be properly recognized for their strengths and their potential when they're often, due to a number of biases that I've referenced earlier, are often not recognized for their capabilities. And so I'm someone that speaks from lived experience as someone who's, underrepresented, neurodiverse, and introverted. They are very, I guess, typical groups of people that don't tend to get as much visibility for opportunities in the workplace. And so the way that our product does this is by capturing a number of different diverse perspectives as different data points to help inform the capabilities an individual has.
That could sound potentially quite complex for someone. So I want to strip it down a bit, okay? So I've heard you speak about the player efficiency rating used in basketball. How does that relate to what you're doing in the workplace?
So the player efficiency rating is a rating that a player gets based on how much they've contributed when they're playing a game of basketball. And so it's no longer necessarily about who has scored the most points, because that's typically only done by 1 or 2 people.
So when you say contributed, it's contributed how much they've contributed to the team they're part of.
In PER, player efficiency rating, they'll look at assists, for instance, as one of the drivers for that. And so if we relate it back to SeenCulture, it's looking at what are if we're able to collect, we do this through 360-degree surveying at the moment, collecting these different perspectives on how someone is seen for certain capabilities. People then have a score of how people are contributing, or at least are seen to contribute, and what their impact is to an overarching team's goals and outcomes.
So if we look at that in practice in a setting, let's say it's an office setting, the way I think about that is there are heaps of people I've worked with in my career who have made my job easier. They've assisted me. They've assisted and helped me be the best version I can be of myself. And if I think about how that's measured, I can't use the same metrics for each one of those people. They assist me in different ways. And sometimes I will be the person that assists someone else to do their job better, and I might not be able to do their job as well as they could. Is that what you're trying to really promote here?
Yeah. There are a lot of the way in which we tend to measure performance or success or whatever it is based on like lagging indicators of financial performance, let's just say. Now, that's really difficult for someone that doesn't have a role that has a straight line kind of impact on that. However, obviously, particularly like operators, for instance, they are like the unsung heroes that don't often get recognition because they're not the ones that are shooting the points, right?
I work with one of those right now, actually, who does everything, moves heaven and earth for me and helps me be the best that I can be. And then at the end of the day, I get a lot of the credit for that. And that's, whilst that's not a choice, that is the way the world perceives, I'm the CEO and co-founder, and they work below me. But ultimately, a lot of the time, they're doing much more work than I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think it's important to make sure that we really bring attention to how we can recognize them. Now, our particular product doesn't measure performance or skills per se. What we measure is perception of them, like i.e. like how they're seen to be. But it's all moderated by who are the greatest kind of contributors to know and understand that. Right. So rather than someone, obviously when you build a bit of a public profile and you get shown in the media or whatever it might be, a lot of the people who are putting on this perception that they don't have any personal actually interaction or understanding of who you are, whereas it's the people that you work most closely with, or it's, your closest family, friends and partners that can really contribute.
Speaking of perception, you chose the name SeenCulture, which I think is a really interesting choice. You're clearly someone who can see things in people that others can't. And like you, I have a psych background. And in my experience, the people who can best perceive some of the more unseen characteristics in others tend to have those or similar hidden characteristics themselves. Is there a part of you that maybe goes unseen that might have informed you wanting to help others be seen for who they are?
Yeah, back in my corporate days when I used to be an employee in an organization, I was always very enthusiastic to propose ideas on how things could be done better. I felt that a lot of that came from a real, I guess, entrepreneurial spirit that I had. And I remember once, like I worked in HR, but I wanted to contribute to a strategic marketing plan. And they were sort of like, no, you're not, that's
That's not your role.
that's not you. That's not your role. And I was like, no, I feel like I could be like I'm, good at BD and building relationships. And that's kind of what it's all about. I see customers and employees as similar in that we're all out there to attract, engage, and retain them, right? Like they're all, at the end of the day, they're all human beings. In any case, like I thought that I myself was very entrepreneurial, but others and leaders in the business did not. And I guess, well, now I'm an entrepreneur, which is great. And I'm recognized for that now, but certainly back then I wasn't.
So I guess what you're saying, the message to leaders from that is that there are probably people in their team that are really good at certain things that might not be seen at the moment, and that with your product, you could help uncover that and essentially really improve a business?
Absolutely. I think we make a lot of assumptions based on someone's either demographic profile or whatever their job title is. And we can tend to, box them into a certain role when the reality is a human being has a dynamic skill set of capabilities that may not be related to, or may not seemingly be related to, a different role, but is. And so in that case, for instance, I believe that there are lots of transferable skills that could be better acknowledged and could be better utilized from a business perspective. Instead of buying or recruiting new talent, we should be looking at, well, actually, if we have a need, might we be able to find it within our existing talent pool instead of going external?
Going back to your funding journey, I've been told that people kept asking you why Culture Amp couldn't do what SeenCulture was doing. So you went and got Culture Amp as a customer to invalidate the premise of the question, which I love. That problem, the assumption that if it could be done, it would have been done by someone with perhaps more authority or credibility, speaks to bias. The fact that you couldn't get around that assumption without proving the premise of the question wrong, it points to issues of self-awareness and people's inability to navigate their biases. And I have no doubt that you pointed to data in response to those earlier questions, but as Cindy Gallop would say, that doesn't fall when you're speaking to a particular type of person. Do you think we need to teach founders the skills needed to navigate around a lack of self-awareness in ways that doesn't involve the traditional approach to business or pitching of using data, and perhaps adopting a more personal or even a psychological approach to solving what is not just business, but a really personal hurdle to overcome in the people that you're sitting in front of?
Yeah. I think it's important to, there's a common understanding, right, even amongst all investors, right, that solving problems matters. And the bigger the problem, then the bigger the potential opportunity for a particular for a an investment kind of opportunity that might be out there. Now, if someone is able to relate to that problem really well, then that should really serve as a strong indicator of their ability to persist with solving for that problem. And we know that pain drives action. And so when someone, i.e., a founder, has experienced personal pain in a way that is unique to them, it serves as a really great, a really great indicator as to why they're the right founder to be solving that problem and can continue to do it outside of having pure, commercial interest for starting a business. And I think that that's the thing that needs to be reminded, back to, I guess, linking it back to the whole role of self-awareness. It's also understanding how the person or the investor that we might be pitching to, what is their frame of reference, such that we as founders pitching for our investment can do our best to relate to them based on where they're at, which is really just, how can we empathize with them such that they can empathize with us, right? And so understanding their worldview and really acknowledging, the fact that they have their own kind of challenges that they're up against as well, demonstrating that, I think, and being able to show, although maybe it doesn't seem like you and I can relate on this surface level, I know and understand that you must be up against making some hard decisions, about who to invest in when you know that you can only invest in 5 out of 500 pitches that you might be getting this year. Yeah, I think that's a way to really think about how you can elevate self-awareness that engages an investor to be able to relate to you when they might not.
You've had some horrific examples of feedback from investors on your journey, like an investor telling you what to wear to a meeting so that you were easier on the eye, another investor giving feedback to Kirsten Hunter that you were becoming too confident, which is often spoken of as a positive attribute in male founders, but perhaps not so much in female founders. I don't just want to focus on the problems you've encountered. I want to talk about how you've overcome those. And one of the themes that came up over and over in my research was a part of your story that hasn't been told in the public domain, and which is completely inconsistent with the suggestion that you think of yourself as a victim. And it's a part of your story which speaks to your strength and your relentless determination. Can you tell me about the experience of having to choose between whether you paid rent or bought food whilst you were starting SeenCulture? Sorry to bring up the trauma of that experience.
No, not at all. Not at all. I guess when you're just so single-mindedly focused on pursuing your vision and mission, because it's something that's personally driven by you, you forget about these other things. And for me, if I'm completely honest, it wasn't necessarily a conscious choice where I was like, I'm not going to pay rent. Instead, I'm going to, try and find more customers for my product. It's just where naturally my attention went and my focus went. One of the many fun nuances of being someone with ADHD, not being able to control where your attention goes necessarily. So yeah, last year I remember having priorities set out for me, and I was like, cool, I'm gonna, try and do this many interviews with this many customers or prospects so that I can get this kind of insight, and I can do this, and this, and hopefully that will lead to this, and outcome. And I guess I was just so focused on it that I kind of just forgot that I needed to find a place to live. And the team experiences it today. Now we've got some systems in place that help prevent this, but I used to forget to pay myself or pay the team. Because in all honesty, payroll is just not something I'm that excited about. But to the point where I would pay for something, and the only reminder that I would get that I needed to pay people was that I couldn't pay for something like literally something like a coffee, and then it would say insufficient funds, and I would notice that it was, I don't know, the 2nd of September. I'd be like, that's why I forgot to pay, and I meant to do that by the 3rd.
I've been told that sort of in the early days of the Techstars program, you'd been on this journey for a little while, and I've heard that you lived off snacks provided during the Techstars Accelerator because things really were that hard for a while. Similarly, Kirsten told me that even during that time, even when you were sort of under that immense pressure, and I know that pressure pretty well, even so, you were still constantly a person who showed up and bound the group together. As I guess someone who goes, or who has gone to and well beyond zero for my mission, I have a very fond respect for people who live and breathe their own in a very real way, and at times a really difficult way. Do you think the disadvantages you faced, whether it be recently in the funding process or even further back in your childhood, make you more likely to and more capable of pushing through challenges like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think because I have experienced a certain level of hardship, and I didn't actually realize this until I was an adult, because obviously until you have a different perspective, you only know what you know, and you're like, this is normal, until someone's like, that's not normal. You're supposed to have these things in your life. What that means is, I guess my baseline for being able to navigate challenges is much higher, I guess, than others. And so what might seem like a challenge doesn't feel that way to me, because I've kind of done life in hard mode to some extent, and when you do life in hard mode, when someone thinks easy, it's like, oh, okay, that's just a thing that I need to overcome.
That's a really interesting point. As outwardly, again, perception only, as someone, as a man standing on the outside looking in, hearing about you being told what to wear to a meeting so that you were easier on the eye, or to show off and I've heard this story elsewhere too, for women founders to show off their curves. But also, as you're struggling at a time financially, did you ever think about, and all these things are happening at once, and you're just like, oh, there's so many hurdles. Did you ever think about giving up on your mission?
No. I never thought about giving up on my mission. I did think about different ways I could pursue my mission, though. Different ways outside of aspiring to be a VC backed startup. But I don't think I know how to not pursue my mission, because I often speak about culture as being the third delivery model of how I've done what I've always done. How do I shine a light on untapped potential? I used to do it working as a HR leader within organizations. And then I did it as a consultant and also working in education, showing others and doing some research around it. And it's like, okay, and now I use tech to do that. It's just a different way of how I've always pursued my mission. And so I've never considered not doing it. I've just considered maybe I can look at a different business model for how I might be able to do it.
In today's introduction, I shared a story from Kate about how you identify the potential in a person that perhaps she couldn't see. But since that person has gone on to become one of their most valued, what do you think happens in the world if more people who've been unseen or have the propensity to go unseen finally get the opportunity to shine? How do you think that actually translates for society and business?
I think a lot. Honestly, I think that we as a society would be better able to solve problems and create a greater landscape for how everyone can flourish, not just a certain subset of people can. And the way that can then have systemic influence would be incredible. At the moment, obviously, so much of our world is governed by a very small group of powerful and influential people, but it's really difficult for them to be able to relate to the people they lead because they're not representative of those people and don't share those same experiences. And so I think this like almost democratization of that power and that influence is what enables us to be able to better experience our lives, not only for our own personal benefit, but also for others and the systems that we're a part of. I know that sounds all very like kind of like, what's the word? I don't know. It's not very tangible, but I guess it's a bit more a feeling thing.
I'm not going to share the details of what they said, but a team member sent me a message this morning thanking me for helping them or facilitating an environment in which they could thrive. And I said, not a problem. That's, it's kind of my thing. But also I kind of disclaimed it and said that, I have really firm belief that the only way that you can create an environment in which you can flourish yourself is if you create an environment where other people can flourish. And as a leader, I think that is something that we lack at the moment. We have leaders who want to create an environment where the loudest voice in the room can flourish, or people who look like them can flourish, or people who are from their group or for whom they have an affinity can flourish, but don't want to create a broader landscape in which everyone could potentially flourish, which I believe is the only way in which we all can. In the past few months, you spoke about diversity, equity, and inclusion before, and it's really become a pivotal conversation at the moment. And obviously, there's a really interesting political landscape in the United States and even in Europe at the moment, which for a lot of people is really, really scary. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that if you are not someone who identifies with the worldview of a particular incoming president or a particular wealthy white man, then the views that they are putting out into the world are potentially really, really, really scary. As diversity, equity, and inclusion policies have come under attack in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of people making their opinions really loud on their day policies. And some of those people think that these policies are simply quotas that take jobs away from the best applicants. What do diversity, equity, and inclusion policies mean to you? And why do you think they're actually important?
I don't know that they mean a lot to me through the lens of like, I guess my comment on DEI kinds of things is that I speak not as an expert on DEI, but just from someone who I know can relate to people who fall within, I guess, minority groups, if that makes sense. That said, I've been on my own learning journey as I've been certainly, because of my own kind of profile, I've been role modeled in this world, and on my own learning journey, I used to be someone that thought quotas were undermining the our ability to be able to, like, I guess, select the people that are most equipped. But I've certainly turned around on that. I believe that. It's much easier to measure these kind of demographic indicators than it is to measure what I would consider to be the actual drivers of success and like our humanness and human potential, which is part of why we do the work that we do. But I do believe that in order to identify the best people for a particular opportunity, we need to include everyone and start with inclusion. And what that means is we need to ensure that let's just, if I use the example of trying to identify the best candidate for a role, right? If our pool of candidates isn't representative of different people from different backgrounds, etc., then we know that there is bias in that pool. And that's why oftentimes, or that's why not oftentimes, but it is important to have representation. Like basically, if I come to scientific terminology, I'm like, you need to make sure that you have a good sample size. Having a good sample size means that you have enough data from a quantity perspective and also enough from a quality perspective. And so ensuring that your pool of talent is a good sample size and i.e. representative of, in my case, the way that I would think about it is either the people you serve in terms of employees or customers, and then looking at that. And so that's the way that I would see it. I feel like maybe there should actually just be a quota with the talent pool. Like I want representation of this, this, and this, and this within the whole people that I'll be reviewing. And then, we'll elevate them along the recruitment kind of stages based on, specific capabilities, but capabilities that are validated by other people's perspectives and references, not just by what this individual can say charismatically in an interview.
I want to go back to quotas in the context of what we said earlier, right? If we have a look at the player efficiency rating in a basketball setting, there's a lot of critics of quotas, but if we have a look at a basketball team, there is a quota. You need a certain type of player in every different spot on that court. And if that is a quota, and if you go out and you try and hire for only one type of player on that basketball team, then you're not going to have a great defense if you've hired a really strong offensive side. And so we do have quotas in the sense that once you measure the things relative to the role, then a quota helps us add members to a team that contribute things that make that team stronger. And if we have a look at what a quota in a DEI setting could allow that would not otherwise exist, is for people who can contribute more to a team that wouldn't be contributed if they weren't considered for the role in the first place. Do you think that's an interesting sort of overlay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredible analogy for how we can really look at these sorts of initiatives from a DEI perspective, because much like, and I reference the Moneyball example actually quite a lot in the work that we do. But what's really important is that we're looking at, well, what is the composition of capabilities or skills and experience that we need across our team? Who do we already have that possess these desired attributes, and where is the gap? And how are we ensuring that we're actually adding into our composition of skills, experience, and expertise, not replicating them? And this is the best way that you can really optimize, the full extent of who you've got, much like how you would look at a sports team. You look at the different positions, you identify the players that best fit them, and you enable them to focus in on the unique strength that they contribute based on the position that they're playing, doing the same within a workplace setting as well.
Yeah, and I think if people have got comfort knowing that you don't build a strong basketball team by, hiring just one type of player, why can't we understand that you don't build a strong business or organizational culture if you hire one type of person? I don't know why it's so hard to understand that. And certainly if you bring more people with varying skill sets to a group, you get a more diverse experience, but you also get a more inclusive and equitable experience as well. I want to finish today's chat with a story that Kate Kurgazova told me about you, which I think points to the most valuable and unteachable trait any founder can have. And these are Kate's words. A few months ago, I caught up with Nikki and asked how she was going. She told me she'd invested every dollar she had. She didn't have any money to pay rent. She didn't have money to eat or live, but she wasn't stopping. I asked her if she was crazy. It was insane. I said, "Are you sure?" Nikki said, "Yeah, I'll work it out." She didn't appear at all afraid, and a lot of people would have been. Most people would have stopped, but not Nikki. Nikki Tugano, thank you so much for not stopping. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I would wish you luck for the future, but I'm pretty sure you don't need it.
Thanks so much, Kane. It's been a pleasure to have a really authentic conversation with you.